you never know how the connections all come together, but
Yep.
thank you for the invite. I'm happy to
Yeah.
be
So
here.
we need you to come to Northwell too, because like I said, others have already joined us.
Okay.
All right. So we're live.
Yes, we're live. Oh, I forgot to share my screen. Good evening and welcome to yet another COVID-19 Conversations. Today we will be talking about, we will be celebrating Juneteenth of Black Doctoring. As usual, your co-moderators are myself, Dr. Maya Williams, and Dr. Alison Myers will be asking the panelists questions tonight. Latest COVID-19 stats, to date we've had over 33 million cases and nearing, if not past, 600,000 deaths. The total number of COVID-19 vaccines, we've delivered 377 million thus far, of which 314 million have been administered. At least 53% of the population has received at least one dose, and 44.5% have been vaccinated, fully vaccinated. And by fully vaccinated, we mean 2 weeks after your second dose for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and 2 weeks after your single dose for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. As of June 15th, Governor Andrew Cuomo stated that we in New York State, 70% of our adult population is vaccinated, which led him to reducing some of the pandemic restrictions that we had. Now, despite everybody wanting to have a hot girl summer or hot boy summer, and the good news is that the world is opening up, let's not forget that we're still in the middle of a whole pandemic. So how did we get there? Far from being a shameful moment of our past, eugenic philosophy is alive and well in the 21st century. Eugenic philosophy was a global scientific and social movement focusing on the manipulation of the racial and ethnic stock to improve society. In other words, eugenic philosophy is a system of thought influenced by core beliefs that many of the worst social problems facing society could be solved by segregating, sterilizing, or even eliminating the physically, mentally, and morally disabled. The eugenics movement took root in the United States in the early 1900s to improve the natural, physical, mental, and temperamental qualities of the human family and quickly focused on eliminating negative traits. Not surprisingly, undesirable traits were concentrated in poor, uneducated, and minority populations. It should be no surprise that our response to COVID-19 uses this familiar blueprint with predictable consequences for the captive and vulnerable who are pushed to the side, ignored, or sacrificed for the greater good. Our COVID-19 policies has helped reinforce this philosophy by creating a literal underclass of the unfit and unvalued whose lives are treated as less valuable. For example, at the start of the pandemic, many doctors had announced to the media that they were forced because of structural inadequacy to choose who to treat, and that is to privilege those who are considered to have greater chances of survival from the virus. At the height of the spring COVID-19 crisis, for example, New York State directed hospitals to release still contagious COVID-19 patients from hospitals into nursing homes in order to open hospital beds, thereby infecting vulnerable residents. Lastly, we have all heard of herd immunity, yet BIPOC communities of colors have higher rates among unvaccinated individuals, a crisis that related more to access than vaccine hesitancy, as was previously stated in the media. The disproportionate effect of the novel coronavirus on African Americans and communities of color has shone a light on the more than century-old struggle to increase the number of Black physicians in the US. This has historically used as the American Medical Association charged Dr. Flexner, a white physician, with the task of evaluating all 155 medical schools in 1910. At the time of filing his report, Dr. Flexner advised that Black medical schools and facilities were inferior and had subpar skills and abilities compared to white physicians and were not in a position to make valuable contributions to medicine and society. He noted of the 7 medical schools for Negroes in the United States, 5 are at this moment in no position to make any contribution of value. The report prescribed a limited role for Black physicians in their practices and hinted that Black physicians possess less potential and ability than white physicians. Also noteworthy about the report was Flexner's Unitarian agreement that Black physicians should serve as sanitarians and hygienists for Black communities in village and plantations. This bigotry of low expectations set a trajectory for Black medical schools and ultimately the recruitment, education, and retention of Black physicians from which medical education has yet to recover. As a result of the Flexner report, Howard and Meharry medical schools were the only Black medical schools which could remain open, thus reducing the number of possible Black physicians even further. In the early 1900s, a mere 2.5% of physicians were Black. A recent study estimated that over 2,700,000 Black medical graduates could have entered the workforce between the time the traditional Black medical schools closed and 2019, if those schools produced physicians at the same rate as Howard and Meharry. The nation's 4 historically Black medical schools have graduated more Black physicians over the last 10 years than the top 10 predominantly white medical schools combined. Research has consistently shown that a large segment of ethnic and racial minorities in the United States population face inequities in both healthcare and quality access. And a growing body of empirical evidence has shown that increasing the diversity of the physician workforce may assist in eliminating health disparities in the US. The recent endemic of the COVID-19 and the social unrest reminds us of the ongoing racial inequities that still exist. Healthcare organizations are now charged to move beyond performative activism and allyship to executing meaningful and measurable anti-racism strategies. According to Dr. Kamara Jones's racism framework, it is vital that healthcare organizations understand their own institutional, social, and political structures, as well as the personal and interpersonal factors that disadvantage minority healthcare professionals, patients, and communities. Governing bodies such as the American Medical Association, which historically excluded Black physicians from joining medical associations, and the American Public Health Association publicly announced racism as a public health crisis in 2020. Despite achieving gender parity in the medical schools, racial ethnic minorities still remain underrepresented in medicine relative to the numbers in the general population. According to the 2016 US Census, racial and ethnic minorities comprise at least 48.7% of the US population, 17% of which were Hispanic and Latino, 13.3% Black or African American, and 2% Native Americans. Over a 10-year period, the proportion of doctorates earned by Blacks or African Americans has risen from 6.2% in 2005 to 6.5% in 2015. And the proportion awarded to Hispanic or Latinos has grown from 5.1% to 7.1%. The number of American Indian or Alaskan Native doctorate recipients increased from 2014 to 2015. And while there was an increase in doctoral degrees, between 1997 and 2017, African American, Hispanic, Latino, and Native Americans made up only 4%, and less than 0.04% of medical doctors, respectively. In 2014, the population of African American and Hispanic Latinos in New York City, one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the US, was 53%, yet only 12% of practicing physicians were underrepresented. This is why pipeline programs are so important. Multiple studies and reports have shown evidence that for minority physicians who choose academic medical careers, continue to experience racism and other toxic working environment factors, which results in them having to prematurely leave their dream careers due to a lack of success, opportunities of being fired, a concept known as leaky pipeline. For example, research has shown racial ethnic disparities in funding between white principal investigators and non-white principal investigators, particularly Black principal investigators. In 2015, a study on NIH grant funding over a 7-year period found that white PIs were 1.7 times more likely to receive grant funding than Black PIs. In a follow-up study in 2019, the researchers found that white PMs were still 1.7 times more to receive grant funding than Black PIs. Interestingly, these results were the same across gender and race and ethnicity, with one chance of getting R1 funding. The researchers found that Black women with PhDs and or MDs were less likely to receive R1 funding compared to white women with PhDs and or MDs. The rate at which white women receive R1 funding was similar to that of white men, even when they submitted fewer grants. And so tonight, we'd like to thank our co-sponsor, the Dr. Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra, Norfolk for sponsoring this event. As usual, we'd like to thank Dr. Naomi Maria, Mrs. Gina Granger, Louise Bentiventner, Dr. Joanna Martinez, our day one audience members. You can continue to follow us at Minority Health Free on Twitter or minorityhealth.convos. Joining us tonight to talk a little bit more about Black doctoring and the Flexner Report and the experiences of underrepresented minorities in medicine is Dr. Quinn Capers, who is an interventional cardiologist, Vice Chair Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Texas at Southwestern, and an inaugural member of the Diversity Task Force of the Society of Cardiovascular Angiography and Interventions. Also joining us is Dr. Leona Corzino, who is an adult endocrinologist and the Associate Dean of Student Affairs Advisory Dean at Duke School of Medicine program. She is also a member of the Latinx Advocacy Team and Interdisciplinary Network for COVID-19, NATIN-19. Also, we have Dr. Monica Weg-Hooper, who is a health psychologist and the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. She co-leads work groups for the NIH-wide initiatives to understand and address the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 among population with health disparities. Before I hand it off to Dr. Alison Myers, please remember that of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back for another show this week where we're talking about Black doctoring. So today we have three esteemed guests on our panel that were just introduced so lovely by Dr. Williams. One of the irony that wasn't mentioned in the PowerPoint was that on the first slide, there was actually two images of two men. And those two men actually are who the two Black medical schools that the Flexner report sort of kept around. So the first one was actually a picture of Mr. Howard, which Howard University was named after, and the other one was for which Meharry. And I honestly never knew until putting this together that both of these historically Black institutions were actually named after two Caucasian gentlemen. So that's an interesting fact. These were two men who actually wanted to help diversify the workforce of Black doctoring, because at that time we did not have Black doctors were not treating non-Black patients. So if it wasn't for the few Black doctors that we had, it would have been definitely even worse off for those of us who are people of color. So speaking along that vein, I want to start off by talking about the HBCU. So Dr. Webb Hooper, there has been increased enrollment, especially with this whole George Floyd and all the inequalities that we've been seeing, that there's actually been an uptick in enrollment at these historically Black institutes, also known as HCBUs. For someone who's interested in being a scientist, would you recommend attending an HBCU?
Well, first, let me start by thanking you, Dr. Williams and Dr. Myers, for inviting me to participate on this panel with my very esteemed colleagues. So I'm happy to be here and participate in the conversation. I have noted what you described in terms of the enrollment at HBCUs increasing. And I think some of the best scientists I know attended an HBCU. So, I mean, I suppose that attending an HBCU is certainly can create really important assets to becoming a scientist or a physician or physician scientist. It really is about attending an institution that will provide students with well-rounded education, that provide opportunities in the scientific space, to inform students about the steps that they will need to complete to become a scientist or to become a physician. It is also really important that for people who want to become scientists potentially, that there's access to a solid research infrastructure, access to professors who are conducting research and have active research laboratories. Of course, we also have to have students who are excited, eager, as well as curious to leverage all of the available resources and to build their scholarly track records. I'd say in addition to having a very strong GPA and standardized test scores, as long as the institution and many HBCUs do have access to working in a lab, I think not all of them do. So it certainly, I think the students certainly need to conduct some research to make sure that they would have the opportunity to gain research experience, which is essential, to get accepted into graduate school to earn, for instance, a PhD, and to work towards a career in science. And then I guess lastly with this, I'd have to underscore that mentorship is key. And that's one of the primary assets about attending an HBCU for underrepresented students. Mentors who can provide the support that we need, relate to our experiences, provide opportunities to learn and explore, and to help students develop independent projects that would help them advance in their professional goals.
Yeah, and there's actually a term that's used in the inclusion literature called the HBCU effect, where they actually find that you find most of the doctors of colors in places such as Atlanta, DC, or Tennessee, because those are the states where you do have these historically Black universities that actually also have a med school attached. So along the lines of support for medical school, one of the other things that comes up is, besides going to an HBCU, is going to school overseas. So traditionally, when people did not have a high GPA or MCAT test score, they would attend medical school overseas. Unfortunately, nowadays, some residency programs are not granting interviews to foreign medical school graduates. When we say foreign medical school graduates, it doesn't mean that you are from another country, but you attended a school in another country. So this is for you, Dr. Leonora. As someone who attended a non-US medical school, what advice would you give to somebody who is contemplating going to medical school outside of the US? Thanks, Dr. Corsino.
Hey, thank you so much. So that's a good question. And I have to share my perspective as someone who went to a medical school outside the US long time ago. I graduated from medical school in '99. So a lot has changed since then. I also want to share that I went to medical school in the country I was born and raised, which is slightly different than someone that was born and raised here and went to some of the Caribbean schools that have different perspective and goals. And what I mean by that is a lot of those schools, and with no disrespect, their goal is to graduate American-born individuals in order to come back. My medical school was different because my medical school is a medical school that was funded in the 1960s with the goal to train physicians to stay in the DR. So it's a slightly different thing. I ended here by chance because my husband at the time was Puerto Rican and he wanted to move back to the US, and that's how I ended here. But my initial intention for my training was not to come to the US. So that being said, we have an array of schools where people go in the Caribbean to get their degree and come back. And it was an opportunity for some students that were challenged because of GPA opportunities, lack of mentorship, and so on, to be able to pursue their dream and come back. Things have changed significantly, as you alluded to, because we do have a lot of increase in the number of people that are applying for residency, but the number of spots for residents has remained relatively stable and competition has increased significantly. So unfortunately or fortunately, residencies have to actually to make the decision. Do I want to accept someone that went to a Caribbean school or outside the US, or do I want to reserve the spot for people that came here and have a big debt and need to get into residency? So that's a tough spot to be in. Also, competition when it comes to USMLE scores is fierce nowadays. Like you see everybody getting perfect score. That's not the way it used to be when I did med school. So that also makes it very challenging for a residency program director to select who they're going to pick for their spot. So if my advice for people that are born here that are trying to go to medical school is to always try to get into a medical school here. Do whatever they need to do. If they need to do a post-bac, I'm the associate director for the post-bac at Duke, the Master of Biomedical Science. If you want to take extra time to build your application, do it, because it's still worth it. Stay here for your medical career. So I hope that answered your question, Dr. Mayers.
So what I'm hearing between what you and Dr. Hooper said is, first of all, you want to pick a college where you'll get a good science foundation, especially you want to get some laboratory experience in college. You want to get some good mentorship. And then as you're applying to medical school, if you're having some issues because your grades might not have been that great or your MCAT wasn't that great, like when we were applying, they said, oh, you can always go overseas. Or sometimes they also recommend go to school in the Midwest. They used to say sometimes some of the schools in the Midwest were less competitive than being on the coast. But other alternative options are what's called a post-baccalaureate program. So you have one there, Duke. There's some others throughout the country. And there are also some programs I've seen too, where you can actually get a master's. You can do a year or two of a master's, and then you can go into medical school. A young lady that I mentored, she actually is in a program at Temple where they take disadvantaged, which can mean a variety of things, students, and you can get a 1-year master's, which helps you transition into their medical school. So I think that's really good information, because I think a lot of people don't know these little hidden gems and jewels that both of you have explained. So, okay, first you going to college, then you're going to medical school, and then you're applying for residency and fellowship. So this question actually is for you, Dr. Capers, because you're more on the residency and fellowship side of things. According to a study by Mehta and al. And JAMA Cardiology in 2019, only 7.5% of practicing cardiologists are underrepresented minorities, and 12.8% of general cardiologists are underrepresented minorities. You have been innovative in your recruitment practices to diversify this resident selected for cardiology fellowship. Can you explain some of the things that you've been able to do to improve upon this?
Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some thoughts with you and the whole wonderful esteemed panel. I appreciate the invitation. So when it comes to diversifying, really, whether you're talking about medical school or residency or fellowship, I like to think of the framework of really having kind of 3 major pillars. And one is working on the pipeline. So preparing people to be competitive when it comes time to apply. And then the actual selection process, what that is, how we read applications, what we value on those applications, and how we select for what we say we want in our program. And then, of course, the last pillar is how you treat people once you get them into your program. So for cardiology, at the Ohio State University, when I arrived in 2007, we were challenged with the knowledge that that institution, the Ohio State University, a great institution, my medical school alma mater, a place where I worked for 13 years, and I always have that Buckeye love, but had not, since the cardiology fellowship training program started in the 1950s, from the 1950s to the time I arrived in 2007, they had not trained one Black cardiologist. So we found that to be a problem. And I'll tell you, I'll make it quick, but I'll tell you this funny story. An organization that I love, the Association of Black Cardiologists, did something innovative. They used to, and I hope they start doing it again, they used to keep a record of programs that had done a great job of graduating Black cardiologists and programs that hadn't graduated any. They called it the Hall of Fame and the Hall of Shame. And they actually ambushed my friend and former cardiology chief at Ohio State, were at one of the major heart meetings. They called him before and said, we'd like to meet with you. The Association of Black Cardiologists would like to meet with you. So he didn't know, they didn't tell him what for. He didn't know what it was for. He thought, oh, maybe they're going to give me an award about my heart failure research. But when he went in to meet them, they greeted him with the knowledge that that your program is one of the programs that has never trained a Black cardiologist. As you can imagine, he was quite embarrassed about that, but it did energize him to do something about it. And one of the things he did was he hired me, but that was only one of the things. But he met with the cardiology fellowship selection team and said, this is a problem and we have to fix it. And so one of the things that we started working on right away was our selection process. So who do we want? What is our mission? Well, we want to create and produce doctors who are taking care of a diverse America. If we're going to do that, then we need to bring in doctors who reflect a diverse America. And that means that we need to actively recruit for diversity. And one of the things that we did, for instance, was we all in academic medicine, we get invitations to go and give grand rounds and give talks. We said amongst those of us who were operating and selecting fellows, we said from now on, here's this canned PowerPoint slide about how great our fellowship is, about how we have diversity as a target, what we want. When you go and visit an institution, ask if you can sit down with the internal medicine residents and the medical students, particularly those who are minority, who might even if they're not sure, who might be interested in cardiology. So the first thing we want to do is increase the number of Blacks applying to our fellowship program. That's step one. Step two, our selection process. Let's make sure if we say we want to produce doctors, cardiologists who are culturally competent, then let's look at on the application who appears to be culturally competent. In other words, let's select for what we want to produce. And then once we get them in, let's be sure that we are treating people appropriately. And so we had a very strong, and still do at Ohio State, mentoring program for all of our cardiology fellows, but especially we took really good care of our underrepresented minority cardiology fellows when they started to come in. We got our first one in 2007, and then we matched 2 in 2008, and then more in 2009. And so we really kind of hovered over them to make sure they had a good experience, because as everybody knows who does any recruiting, your best recruiters are then people in your organization who have been treated well, because they go back and tell their colleagues and their friends, listen, when you're looking for cardiology fellowships, you really might want to consider Ohio State. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that helps. It's about recruiting. So we increase the number applying, and then that selection process, making sure that you're selecting for what you want. And what we wanted was diversity and cultural competence. And we wanted to produce cardiologists that we thought could make a dent in trying to reduce healthcare disparities. And then step 3, once you get them in your program, treat them with respect and like they really are valued.
Thank you. And you know, this lack of diversity is not only seen in doctoring, but it's also seen on the research side of things. Whether you're a PhD or an MD researcher, as noted earlier, there's definitely a discrepancy in terms of funding when you're Caucasian versus if you're Hispanic, Asian, or Black. In 2011, Dr. Ginther of the University of Kansas and colleagues at the NIH and Discovery Logic Thomson Reuters analyzed new R01. And just for those of you who are not familiar with what an R01 is, it's a pretty big grant. It's usually multi-million dollars. So you have to really be on top of your game to get one of those. So they analyzed new R01 applications submitted for possible funding between fiscal year 2000 and 2006. And their primary finding was that grants submitted with African American or Black principal investigators, that's the person who's leading the study, and that was only 1.5% of the sample, were funded at a rate of 17.1%, whereas applications where the principal investigator was white, and that was 69.9% of the total, were funded at a rate of 29.3%. So this question is for you, Dr. Hooper. What is your division of the NIH doing to improve upon this?
So the Ginther report really was seminal piece of evidence, and there have been studies that have followed it, but that was really, the first study to document this funding gap by race ethnicity among NIH applicants. I think there's a little bit of good news, although there still is a gap. Our most recent data from NIH with regard to R01 grant applications. So the number of applications among African American or Black, Latino, Hispanic, really all groups, you see an increase in applications to NIH for R01s between 2013 and 2020. Unfortunately, we still see the race gap, the race ethnicity gap when you compare the data from 2013 through 2020. So just to update, I guess, on the numbers that you just reported. So in 2013, white investigators had a funding rate of about 21.8%, and that was about 18% among Asian scientists, about 17.7% among Hispanic Latino scientists, and 12.2% among African American or Black scientists. Fast forward 7 years, and now you're in 2020, everyone's had an increase in applications. You still see the gap, though, where the funding rate among white scientists is 31%, as compared to 27.5% among Latinos and 23.6% among Black or African American scientists. So aside from the group who is very small and identifies as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, African American or Black scientists still have a low funding rate and this gap. So at NIH, we recently launched an initiative called the Unite Initiative. And Unite followed the events of the infamous 2020, So COVID-19 and then the social injustices that, and I think we know that the May 2020 police killing of George Floyd, followed by more recent killings of primarily Asian American women in Atlanta, really motivated action. And NIH is one institution for which we see action. The NIH director, Dr. Francis Collins, issued a statement of apology to all individuals in the biomedical research enterprise who had suffered disadvantages due to structural racism. Now, we know that many places and businesses were giving such apologies, but we know that they're far from enough. And what I've been really delighted to see is that Dr. Collins is taking this very seriously. There are a number of meetings that have happened since then, and the launch of Unite in February of this year brought together for the first time all NIH institutes and centers to focus on addressing structural racism in biomedical science, both as it's manifested by the biomedical workforce and in health disparities, minority health, and health equity research. And so I lead one of the committees of Unite, which is called the U Committee, and that one's on understanding stakeholder and learning from stakeholder experiences. There's also a committee focused on new health disparities research funding, one focused on the internal NIH culture, and one focused on the external biomedical research enterprise. And the overall goal is to move us away from the status quo and to understand what the factors are that keep us at the status quo, and to really look at the policies, that are facilitating structural racism in science. So, it's not just NIMHD, we're a part of it, but it's an NIH-wide initiative. And I think there's never been anything quite like the Unite initiative. And, there's a long way to go. And we recognize that there's so much work to be done. What I'm, optimistic about is that this is the moment, even though I have to say I'm a little skeptical too. I'm wondering, like, will we really see something change now? I think that this is the opportunity. While there is some momentum, and it's been, we're 1 year post the murder of George Floyd, and we've still managed to keep this momentum up. And I don't see it slowing down, which is positive. And one of the issues that is of primary concern in the external community is this success rate gap for receipt of R01 equivalents from Black or African-American scientists. So we're looking at that and going to be gathering more information from stakeholders and looking at the policies that might be able to be modified in order to really see meaningful change in this regard.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Some of these issues in terms of disparities we've been seeing also on the medical school side of things, where we've seen declines in certain of our groups. So unfortunately in research, we're getting underfunded, but we're also seeing less of our folks being retained and getting into medical school and staying in med school. This question is for you, actually, Dr. Corsino. Healthcare institutions, medical schools, and academic centers are keen on recruiting underrepresented minorities into their institution, yet disparities continue to exist in the retention and promotion of women and underrepresented minorities faculty into higher ranks and senior leadership positions. And many folks feel that their organizational climates are chilly and the primary reason for leaving medicine. So what's the difference between diversity and inclusion? And why do you think inclusion may be the key for the diversification of the biomedical workforce, which is something that Dr. Hooper just so saliently commented on?
That's a good question. I think Dr. Kappers can also talk about this a little bit, because I know he's done a lot of work on this area. But I think initially the focus was to increase numbers, and a lot of institutions were very successful in increasing numbers. However, if you are in an environment that is hostile, that you are mistreated, as he alluded, how do you get received? Are you included in the discussion or important conversations? There's no inclusion. And without inclusion, we're going to keep having people leaving academia, which is where I practice, because if you are in an environment that is not conducive for growth and you are receiving a lot of microaggression and a lot of racism, then there is not opportunity for you to stay there. And that's why I think one of the articles that you highlighted in the PowerPoint is an article about a physician, an African-American woman, that left academic medicine for the same reason. She was there, the numbers were high, but she was not included in any important conversation. She was mistreated by her own colleagues. She was mistreated by her patient. And then she decided, why do I stay here and leave? And I think until we achieve inclusion, real inclusion, where people are seated at the table where decisions are being made, and we address the structural racism of this country, then we are not making a lot of progress. I think numbers looks good in graphs and table, but they don't mean a lot much for any of us that are trying to achieve success in academic medicine. I think that's where a lot of institutions are moving to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because also you don't achieve much if you have inclusion, but there's no equity on everybody that is part of your organization or group. So I hope that answers your question. I think in my institution, we are putting a lot of emphasis into this anti-racism. And I think until we had the commitment of our president, our dean, and everybody that has been said out loud, we want to be an example. We want to actually break the structural racism of why people are not being accepted, why people are not being promoted, why people are not getting paid the same way. We are going to continue to have that leaky pipeline that Dr. Capers mentioned earlier.
Yes, and speaking of which, I want to turn to you, Dr. Capers, because Dr. Corsino hit on several of the points. Of course, you have microaggressions, but we also have implicit bias and stereotype, which is also further making some of these environments chilly. And what's been also very disappointing is the fact that we've seen fewer and fewer Black male doctors. In 2015, of all the students who were enrolled in med school, only 35% were men, and that was a decline by 57% in 1986. What are some of the barriers for our Black men in attending medical school? And I think, as you noticed when you came on the panel, you're surrounded by female, so I think it also unfortunately speaks to what's happening. But what are some of the barriers to Black men attending and matriculating from medical school, and the cause of these lack of Black men in medication? I'm sorry, in medicine.
Yes, well, thank you so very much for that question, which is a profound one that we're all working very hard to try to correct and to reverse. When it comes to Black men in medicine being at almost a crisis level shortage, the story really goes back to, you got to think about Black boys. And I'm glad you mentioned in this same question, implicit bias, this notion that we all have unconscious likes or dislikes that are occurring outside of our awareness and control. And many of them come from the images that we see all the time. And so if you go back to the early grades of school, kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth grade, studies in the educational literature show disparities in punishment of school-age children. And so, I mean, Black girls have it hard too, but Black boys specifically, and it can be the exact same behavior. And so, when I give a talk about this, the example I use is the teacher is at the blackboard, and she told the class to, read your book, and then a paper airplane goes flying by. She turns around and she sees a little white boy. If in her brain, white equals good and white equals smart, then she says, "Oh, Johnny, Johnny, you better get back to work." If she turns around and sees a little Black boy who just flew the paper airplane, if in her unconscious mind, Black equals danger, Black equals anger, Black equals violence, he's going to the principal's office and he might get expelled, but it's the exact same action. And so we have little Black boys that learn pretty quickly in their scholastic career that they are bad, that they are misbehaved, that they are a problem. And we know that it's around third and fourth grade that minority children in particular stop thinking that being a doctor is realistic. And that just continues then on to middle school and then the high school. And it's very easy if a young Black boy or Black young man, teenager, doesn't have somebody encouraging them, doesn't have a mentor, doesn't have role models saying you can do it, it's very easy for them to think about success in other ways, or to just think, when they look at a doctor, looks cool, but that's not for me. That's not something for me. And so we have to do something about this, and we're trying really hard. We have a lot of people doing a lot of different things with the school system, being role models for children, being role models for teenagers, letting college students shadow us. A few years ago, some of you, before we started broadcasting, mentioned two of my compadres and good friends at Ohio State, Dr. Darrell Gray, Dr. Joshua Joseph. They were with a group along with me and other Black male physicians who started in 2017 this Twitter campaign, hashtag Black Men in Medicine, where we said, you know, what if we absolutely flood social media with images of Black male doctors? Hopefully we'll encourage young people. Hopefully we'll have a platform to speak out against injustice, which we do. But maybe if we do it enough, if we surround the world, if you will, with images of Black men as doctors, then maybe it will change the unconscious bias that the nation has about Black men, from an unconscious association of Black man equals danger to maybe Black man equals physician. That's one reason I'm wearing my white coat. The other is because I was in the cath lab and I don't have a nice suit jacket to put on, but we want people to see Black men in white coats to kind of start working on that unconscious bias. So the problem with the shortage of Black men in medicine starts early. So that means that fixing it, the therapy for that problem, is going to mean kindergarten, first grade, high school, college, and working on medical school admissions processes, which we are. So we need people deployed at so many places along that pipeline to help plug up that pipeline. And I can say I'm really encouraged by so many people that see this as the problem that it is and that are working on it.
So we see disparities in education. We're seeing disparities in role models, and disparities in how our kids are being punished. I think another disparity that we need to touch on is disparities of what is being pumped and pushed into our communities for our kids. And one of those such things are menthol cigarettes. Companies like L'Oreal, and I forget the company that makes Cool, has for years and generations particularly targeted communities where you find young Latino and Blacks. And Dr. Hooper, this is something that you've done research on. And the Biden administration is really seemingly committed to this menthol ban. And again, this is something that's been destroying a lot of the young people in our community. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, since I know you've done research in that area.
Yes, and I am just delighted by the potential for menthol tobacco products to be banned, because about 80 to 90% of African American or Black individuals who use tobacco products are smoking menthol products, and about 35 to 40% among Hispanic and Latino individuals, adults and youth. And this is because of aggressive, targeted marketing by the tobacco industry for decades. The problem with menthol, there's several problems with menthol products, is that one is that they're easier to smoke. It's easier to smoke menthol cigarettes because of the cooling sensation. There's also evidence, and our group has published some of this evidence, that these are tobacco products, cigarettes in particular, that are harder to quit. People are also, smoking little cigars, Black and Milds. These products also have higher nicotine and tar content. There's little evidence to say that menthol is responsible for an exacerbation or disproportionate burden in terms of health problems. But we do know that if the products are easier to smoke and harder to quit, then you have the potential for increased long-term exposure and thus potential for health problems and disparities. Actually, the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act was signed into law in June of 2009 by President Obama. And that was the first piece of legislation in our history that granted the FDA authority to regulate the manufacturing, distribution, and marketing of tobacco products. And in that act, flavorings were banned in tobacco products. So you couldn't, make cigarettes that had chocolate, gum, candy, coffee flavors. When we were kids, when I was a kid, they were like cigarette gum that looked exactly like cigarette. You could no longer do that. The exception in that law was menthol. And so myself and others in the field of tobacco control were really just flabbergasted and disappointed that menthol was the one exception. And so many local advocacy groups have been working on this for decades, national organizations, researchers working tirelessly to move toward a ban. And in 2019, actually, end of 2019, Massachusetts was the first state to restrict the sale of all flavored tobacco products, including menthol. And then in 2020, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New York, all enacted bans on flavored e-cigarettes. And then California was the second state to prohibit both flavored e-cigarettes and menthol cigarettes. And there are other localities that have passed restrictions, I think over 300, and at least 120 communities now restrict the sale of menthol cigarettes. So if this becomes a federal law, it has potential to reduce smoking prevalence in racial ethnic minority communities, particularly African Americans, but and also Latino Hispanics, has a potential to really improve health and population health, and to reduce and ultimately eliminate tobacco-related health disparities. And that's the goal of this. There are people who are against it, who think that there will be, sort of a black market of menthol cigarettes, if you will. But I think those of us in public health are much more concerned about reducing the health problems and the disparities that result from using tobacco products.
And if someone's watching today, how could they get into this type of field? We talked about how you can become a doctor. How could you become a researcher like you to do this type of work?
Well, I am by training a clinical health psychologist. And so, there are lots of people who study this field, and for example, prevention and tobacco regulatory science and tobacco interventions. A clinical health psychologist, someone like me, is someone who earned a PhD in clinical health psychology or behavioral medicine. It's mind-body work, mind-body research. It's a specialty within psychology that investigates and implements clinical services across diverse populations. And the goal that we focus on is health promotion, well-being, and to prevent, treat, and manage illness and disability. So we work alongside physicians in many cases because we're really looking at, I think of it as a more holistic than the biomedical model for sure, because we're looking not only at the person's physical state, but we're also looking at the sort of confluence of psychological, social, cultural, as well as biological factors to help us understand health and well-being. We're also very focused on addressing social determinants of health. We have more time to spend with our patients than physicians do. So we get to know them quite well. And we're treating people who they could be healthy people for the purposes of health promotion and disease prevention. They could also be people who are at elevated risk for disease because of maybe genetic carriers or people who engage in risky behaviors. And we also work with people who have psychological problems that are impacting their health. You have to be mentally healthy to maintain physical health. So I also work and have worked a lot with chronic disease, people with chronic diseases, and people who are at risk because of their behavior. So as a part of that work, that's why I focused on tobacco when I learned that it, sort of killed more people per year than COVID-19. Not, I guess not, now that we're at 600,000, but it's about 400,000, it was 500 per year, but about 400,000 per year die from tobacco. And I was always interested in minority health and health disparities. And so for me, it was combining many of the things I care about and addressing a behavioral problem and addiction that leads to so many physical and mental health consequences. So that was my path.
Thank you. That's very interesting. It's interesting how we get to paths, and that sort of touches on not really a question, but it's like earlier that you alluded to that there is an increase in the number of individuals who apply for funding. And typically Black and brown individuals apply for funding in health disparities because that's what they're passionate about. But at the same time, they don't get the funding. The funding probably goes to somebody else, or somebody who's from the majority or something of that sort. So what can we as, researchers, because I believe I'm not too sure for Dr. Capers and Dr. Coseno, but I know Dr. Myers and I are health disparities researchers who are interested in these kind of things. And that is why we initially started COVID-19 Conversations, because we felt that the information was not getting out there to our people. So as up and coming, researchers, anybody who's listening, who's interested in health disparities, it's like, how can they get to do the research, or starting point of getting the research?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I do want to clarify, and you said this, but I do want to also make this point that while many racial ethnic minority scientists, well, there's probably a greater likelihood to study health disparities. Most health disparities research are white. Most researchers are white, and that's also true of health disparities researchers. And then we have underrepresented scientists and physicians who study things other than minority health or health disparities. But we do know that, this is something that we're looking at very closely at NIH. We know that racial ethnic minority scientists are more likely to study these kinds of concerns and questions and want to do something because they understand the community and they understand what is happening. We're also more likely to study community engaged science. I bring a perspective to NIH that is one of an investigator before I joined NIH. So I know the struggle of trying to get your research funded, trying to convince researchers on the review, on the study sections, that this really is important work. And I always felt like I had to over justify and explain why what I was doing was important. It really requires persistence. I mean, one of the problems, and that we have to do something about this, is that African-American or Black researchers are less likely to resubmit. And so you have disparities at every stage along the funding pathway. I don't use the pipeline because of the leaky stuff. So I always say pathways, whether it's education or anything else, it's a pathway. And along that pathway at every step, you have disparities. And one is who's likely to come back in. And as it relates to NIH funding, given how competitive it is, certainly you don't come back in, you're not going to be successful. So it requires a persistence. It also requires, I think, looking at the career award mechanisms, like the K award mechanisms and the T awards, and those things that will help prepare a scientist for gaining an R01 or earning an R01. And those are some of the things that I had to do and learn about how to do that. The other thing I will suggest, and now I'm a steward of the federal government, but some of my funding wasn't NIH funding. Sometimes I had to seek funding at other foundations and organizations who had a mission consistent with what I was interested in and would allow me to obtain funding to carry my work forward. Building a track record of being able to obtain grants, be successful, publish your work, disseminate it, those things are going to be important for your NIH application and BioSketch to show that you actually have the skill set and the fortitude to be able to responsibly carry out a project that NIH would fund. But because NIMHD, this is what we fund, this is the kind of work that we focus on, but NIH-wide, there is, all institutes have a mission, or not necessarily a mission, but some work that they fund in the area of health disparities. So of course, the other piece is working with program officers, finding people who believe in what you're doing. We know that there are challenges there as well. Like, well, what are the demographics of the program officers at NIH? Will we find people who are interested in us? It's complicated, but I still firmly believe that staying persistent, refining your projects, and continuing to bring them forth will lead you to success.
Thank you. And that's very interesting. And before we wrap up, I sort of want each of you to just say, like, throughout your entire successful careers, like, as minorities, what has been the one thing that has carried you through it all to get you to the point that you are right now? And so for any student who is listening, for any underrepresented minority who is a researcher, like, what advice would you give to your younger self, and what advice would you give to them? So feel free, any of you, to go first.
Okay. So I'll go first. So the one thing that motivated me from when I was a child and wanting to be a doctor, and it keeps me motivated, is really this desire to be a humanitarian and to help ease suffering, ease pain. And there are times when doctors can't do that, but then to give hope. And so if you are a doctor in training, whatever it is you're putting up with, microaggressions, discrimination, maybe people mistaking you for someone, anybody other than a doctor. I'm sorry that you're dealing with that, but you will find ways to conquer that. But keep in mind that patient, and your high calling, that you're giving comfort, you're easing somebody's burden. Always think about the patient. If you're not in medicine yet, but that's what you aspire to, think about the patient. Don't think about any of the other trappings that you think come along with being a physician, but think about that person whose burden you're going to lighten. This is a high calling, and that's what motivated me, and that's what keeps me smiling, that I get to do what I love every day.
Thank you.
I can go next. I went to medicine and endocrinology because of diabetes. My dad had diabetes. He was diagnosed when I was young. So that was my main motivation. However, my main motivation these days for all the work I do in medical education is to be that role model for the next generation of underrepresented students. When I came to Duke, I was the only Latina in my division. There were a handful of Latina faculty when I came, and I made a commitment that it was not possible that in a country like this one, that is viewed as the best country in the world, people like me didn't have someone to follow. So I made that a commitment, and that's my motivation to be able to help, in particular, the Latino students, but all minority students, to see that someone like me, that look like me, that have an accent, can achieve success in academic medicine, and that is possible if they work hard and they stay focused. And one of the things that had helped me not be part of those that leave academic medicine is having a great mentor. I have to acknowledge publicly here in this forum that I was blessed of having an outstanding African-American mentor during residency, Dr. John Flack. I'm going to give his name. Some of you know him, who worked really hard for those African-American patients with hypertension in Detroit, Michigan, a place where a lot of people don't want to go. And he was a great mentor for me. And my mentor, Laura Spedke at Duke University, that some of you also know, was also a great mentor that actually supported me and guided me through a whole very challenging process of being a very underrepresented person in an institution like Duke. She was the one that always motivated me not to give up and always supported me. She was more than a mentor, she was an advocate. And I think that made a huge difference in why I'm still here and why I have achieved the achievement that I have achieved so far. And I want to be that person for the next generation.
Thank you. Dr. Hopper, do you want to go?
Well, I'll just mention, I know we're at the end of our time, and I concur with a lot of the same things that my colleagues have shared in terms of why they do what they do and how they made it. I guess my one other piece of advice would be to keep your options open, to stay open to a variety of things, explore your interests. What you think you're interested in the beginning may not be where you're really drawn. So stay open to opportunity. And when you see them, don't be afraid to throw your hat in the ring. I think sometimes we might hesitate, but you might be surprised if you just throw your hat in the ring. Worst case scenario is you don't actually get the job you're looking for that time, but you would have learned something through the process. So always, I think, take a shot.
Thank you very much. And I would just like to end by saying, when we started this, I don't think, with the exception of Dr. Myers and Dr. Casino, none of us had ever met each other before. But we got to know each other through a series of events that we had gone through. And I believe it was Dr. Myers who said that we're such a small community and there's so little of us that we're always like, we'll know each other. You know, somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. And that made me remember, like, one thing that is very big in the Latino and the African-American community or the Black community is community. That's what we depend on. We depend on the backs of each other. We stand on each other. We stand as community. We know that, and that's what keeps us thriving. And so as we end the talk today, I want everybody to remember, one of these days, one of my good friends, she once told me that your education will get you to the door, but your connections will get you through the door. So as much as whether you're an introvert and extrovert, as much as you can, do what you can to get a mentor. Do what you can to get somebody who has gone before you. Representation matters, and that person will take you through the door. And so before I end the show, I just want to mention that next, Dr. Myers is having an event, and that event is the Juneteenth event. It's going on from June 14th to June 18th. Actually, on June 19th, 2021, between 10 and 6 p.m., there'll be, I think it's a march or something at Royal Wilkins Park, and that's in Queens. And our next event will be on substance use, and it will be on July 7th. So please join us. Sorry, it will be on July 8th. So please join us July 8th, same place, same time. Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists for joining us. This was great. And we will see you again in the next 2 weeks.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Come out on Saturday, Roy Wilkins Park, 10
Bye.
to 6 for a great day of fun, vendors, and entertainment and exercise.
Bye.